What's up, guys? This is Coach Alex VanHouten with Better Daily. Tonight, we are talking about activity monitors. Tonight's presentation workshop is called One Step at a Time. We're going to be making sense of modern activity monitors. This is going to be a powerful conversation about the health and fitness related to things that we can track with regard to steps. If you've played around with an activity monitor, heard them, seen them, or were interested in getting connected one for yourself, that's something we're going to be talking about this evening, and some of the research behind the metrics that you might care about with regard to activity monitors. And these suckers have come a long way. They can be very confusing sometimes, and so I hope that we can answer those questions for you. And we have several members of the Better Daily community in here to ask questions as they pop up. So tonight's agenda, as always, with regard to our workshops, what's really important to me is not that I get through all the content that I intend to talk about this evening, but that you get your questions answered. That's why we do these live workshops. So I'm going to talk just a bit about some group updates. It'll take me about 3 minutes to walk through that. And then the why, we'll talk about inspecting what you expect from a activity monitor perspective. We'll talk about the how, we'll talk about moving and resting and some research around that. And then we'll talk about the what, the many reports that you can get out of activity monitors nowadays. They can be as simple as how many steps did I walk today, to as complicated as how much REM sleep and deep sleep did I get? What's my heart rate variability compared to my rest look like? How many intensity minutes did I get? There's a lot of different measures in activity monitors nowadays. So let's dive into that. The first real simple group update, we have initiated what we call the Betterment bot in the app. And so if you've been friended, connected, or followed by the Betterment bot or messaged, that is a member of my team, sometimes myself, sometimes somebody else. And what we're doing with the Betterment bot is making it easier to get connected to the group. So thus far, in the last few months since launching the app, we've added a lot of resources and a lot of opportunities and functionality to connect in the application, and you don't know it's there unless somebody points you in that direction. And so the Betterment bot will be taking some of that off my shoulders. It's not really a bot. We don't do the AI thing around here. That's one of the things that's wrong with social media, in my opinion. And so this community is a little different from that. But the idea of having your friendly neighborhood community bot to help point you in the right direction and to stand in when a coach isn't available is there. So I look forward to your feedback on that, and I also look forward to evolving that over time to be helpful and powerful in your corner of betterment. So let's start with the why. We had a few burning questions slightly prior to this workshop, and then also that were submitted to me when I said, hey, we're going to do this activity monitor thing. And then I'm sure we'll have some follow-up questions asked by those who are joining us live. And so activity struggle, because these burning questions are from the Better Daily community. One, how much should I be moving daily? And when you come to an activity workshop, that's probably the most important question at the top of your list, is how many steps should I be getting, right? Because there's stuff out there, marketing and research and whatnot, that'll tell you should get 5,000, or you should get at least 10,000, maybe 15,000, or maybe it doesn't matter how many steps you get in a day, right? Which is not true, by the way, and we'll talk about that tonight. So how much should you be moving daily is a powerful question. We'll be talking about that. We'll also be talking about what is a sleep score, how do they get that, what does it mean? And there's actually some interesting research around male-female differences with regard to activity and sleep. And in 2 weeks, we'll be having a workshop specifically about sleep. So I'm going to do kind of a 10,000 foot view of the sleep tracker stuff today. And then in 2 weeks, we're just going to hit sleep from every direction we can think of in our workshop. So if we have follow-up questions here that I can cover in that workshop, let me know. And then if there's some burning questions that are related to sleep that we get into this evening, that would be great as well. And then another question was, what's heart rate variability, or what's the stress score, and what is that? And so we'll talk a bit about heart rate variability this evening as well. Two other questions that were dropped prior to the workshop that aren't here on the slide are one, what about this calorie measure? What is that? What is my activity monitor telling me about calories burned and how many calories I can eat now and how that offsets? So we'll talk about that. And then the other question was, what's the most important measure? You know, if you get one of these bad boys and you're looking through the app, there's a whole bunch of stuff. There's sleep and there's stress and there's intensity minutes and there's heart rate and all that. What's the most important for me and my goals. And so we'll talk about that this evening as well. As you can imagine, it varies depending on what you're trying to get better at. So first, why activity? Why does activity matter? Why is it worth tracking? And it's a very important question. In the research, we've only started looking at this over the past 30 years or so. And that is, being able to measure steps, measure movement. Now, it's important that we differentiate between activity and exercise real quick, because the research on exercise is different from the research on activity. And this you'll notice when we get to things like intensity minutes as measured by activity monitor versus exercise. They're different. So there's activity, that's how many steps you get in a day, basically how much you move. I'm getting a few getting a few steps here, right? And you're like, hey, that's cheating, that's not steps. But the idea is, how much do you move? How and how do you differentiate that? Most activity monitors work on an accelerometer, which means it calculates how often the activity monitor switches directions. If you've used an old school pedometer, you actually used to be able to hear it. It was like a little tiny lead weight that was in there, and you clipped it on your hip or something, and when you walked, you could hear it click, 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 and it literally just popped up and down and hit a little node. And so it had a digital or analog counter that would trigger a step every time the activity monitor or pedometer pop down in there. Now these are quite a bit more sophisticated. Now they work with a very similar, modern day activity monitors work with a very similar technology that your smartphones do. So like if you turn your smartphone sideways, it knows, hey, we've turned sideways. And the accelerometer in there is a much more complicated process than just a little lead weight, right? So what it's doing is measuring how much you move, which is different from measuring exercise. And a very simple definition of the two is, activity is how much you move, and exercise is movement that results in adaptation. So I'm going to say that again because that's really important. Activity is different from exercise. Activity is how much you move on a regular basis, whereas the exercise is movement that is stressful enough, it's intense enough to result in an adaptation. So I'll give you an example. I like to run, and it's normal for me to run maybe 6 to 10 miles in a week, right? If I go for a walk, that's activity for me. It does not create any adaptations. I'm moving. I'm used to running. I'm used to moving around. I'm used to walking. It does not create adaptations for me. That's a step count, but it doesn't actually stress my body out such that my legs are sore the next day. I mean, you got to put a backpack on me, maybe make me carry Bennett, my 2-year-old, for a few miles. That would be exercise. But activity requires adaptation. Now, if you take somebody who hasn't been running or isn't getting a lot of steps in a day, and you put us side by side and we both go for a walk might be activity for me and not exercise, but a walk might be exercise for them. It might make them winded. It might make their legs sore the next day. It might do that sort of thing. And I'm not saying I'm in the most, the Olympic level shape or anything, but this is at the core of the confusion about activity monitors, is that activity is not exercise unless you're deconditioned. So activity is not exercise unless you're deconditioned. If you've been exercising, then activity is like your floor level of movement in a day. Whereas if you haven't been exercising, then activity can be pretty stressful and difficult. And so increasing your step count is not a matter of, I'm just going to go for a walk today. It's a matter of actually being intelligent about periodization. And so we'll talk a little bit more about that when we talk about how many steps you should be getting in a day. And this is important because activity has been associated with longevity. There was a groundbreaking study done about 8 years ago that looked at all-cause mortality. All-cause mortality is your likelihood of dying from all causes. And what they found, this was a longitudinal study, and by study, they didn't do a randomized controlled trial. They didn't say, hey, you're the people who are going to exercise and not be active, and you're the people who are active and aren't going to exercise. They just looked at step count, and they looked at how often these people reported exercising. And what they found was that those who were active, not those who worked out, those who were active and got 10,000 or more steps in a day were much less likely to die in the next 10 years than those who worked out but weren't active. So, longevity, how long you live, might be connected to how active you are versus how often you exercise. Now, I'm not saying exercise isn't important, but that's another can of worms for another day. Basically, saying that if you can get more steps, if you can move more on a regular basis, that bodes well for all cause mortality, diabetes, cancer, thyroid dysfunction, heart disease, breaking hips. There's all kinds of things that can play into all cause mortality. And so activity is a powerful part of reducing the probability of mortality. Then disease, I mean, cardiometabolic disease, thyroid dysfunction, even like things like triglyceremia or high blood pressure, those sorts of things are lowered in direct proportion to how active somebody is. The more active you are, the less likely you are to deal with these chronic diseases. Metabolic activity is also affected by activity. So generally your basal metabolic rate, how active your metabolism is and how much energy you can tap into and burn from your food, how many calories you burn in a day, is directly linked to activity as well. There's kind of a tipping point around the 15,000 steps per day mark. So that you would think more activity is better, and we'll talk about some studies in just a second. But around the 15,000 calorie mark, your metabolic benefits decrease or go to zero. In fact, in one study, they looked at Aboriginal tribes in Africa and did activity monitoring on them and their basal metabolic rate. And what they found is these folks were doing like 32,000 steps per day, but their metabolic rates were about the same as a sedentary American who was getting about 5,000 or less steps per day. So it didn't actually increase their basal metabolic rate to do a whole bunch more. Now, there are some compounding variables. They weighed on average 80 pounds less than a sedentary American. So, they had a little less lean muscle mass, or excuse me, a little less mass to keep up and whatnot. But anyway, very, very interesting. If you are currently labeled sedentary, meaning you're getting 5,000 or less steps per day, then increasing your activity anywhere between your 5,000 and 15,000 will result in increased metabolic activity. Fat utilization is another piece of this. The more active somebody is, the more steps they get in a day, regardless of their exercise and regardless of their nutrition. The more steps they get in a day, the more they burn fat as a fuel source versus carbohydrates. And so this is very important. The average person in America is eating too many carbohydrates and not exercising enough to warrant that short-term fuel source. And so what happens is over time, they condition their body to burn carbs and not be able to tap into their fat stores. So activity is a part of that. Getting more steps in a day is a part of signaling to the body that it needs to be able to use those long-term fuel stores, which are your fat stores. And then sleep and stress, we'll talk about this more in just a second, especially in females. The amount of activity somebody gets in a day is directly related to improvements in sleep quality. And then last but not least, unfortunately, compared to what much of the fitness industry has been preaching, it's not usually helpful as a caloric offset, meaning Fitbit or Garmin will say, hey, because you got 10,000 steps a day, you can eat 300 more calories or something like that. And while that might be effective for the short term for somebody, in the long term, eating more and being more active aren't as related as exercise is to how much food we eat. So we can talk more about that also in a moment. So I talked a bit about why activity in the next slide. We'll look at some actual like pictures or screenshots of things that we can measure. But before I get into those pictures and why technology can be helpful for us on that front, and then getting into some studies, did this slide bring up any questions from anybody that weren't there before that you don't mind throwing down? I'll pause for a second here, and if you are live and you want to ask a follow-up question to something I said here, go ahead and unmute and let me know.
Hey, Alex, how do you know if mine does a heart
rate?
Heart rate. How do I know what it's set on is correct for me?
Very good question. So what I think you're asking is, how do I know if the zones that it has created for me are appropriate for my fitness? Okay, very good question. And for those of you who haven't played around with an activity monitor yet, what you'll note is if you set your age in there, basically what it's doing is it's creating heart rate zones 220 minus your age, right? And that's your max heart rate, and then they take 70% or 80% of that. The two things I would say about that is the older we get, the more accurate that equation becomes. So for somebody in their 20s and 30s, yeah, nice. One of the perks, right? They didn't put that in the fine print of the Getting Old book. I'm just kidding. But the 20s and 30 somethings, there can be a huge variability because they're 220 minus your age when you're 20 is 200, and your amount of heart rate variability within those heart rate zones can be very different. 20-year-olds who are deconditioned doesn't make much sense, but as we get older, that number gets much smaller. So 220 minus 60, for instance, is 160. There's not a lot of play room between that and a resting heart rate. That's 40 beats different. So that said, as far as most activity monitors are concerned, all they're interested in is what is classified as intense activity, exercise. And from a research perspective, that is 70% or more of your max heart rate. So 160, if you're 60 years old, 220 minus 60 is 160, and then 70% of 160 is hard to do in your head. Just a second. 32 plus 80 is 112. So 112 or higher would be considered intense for 60 and up. But that you can set that. Most watches will let you set that. The only reason that matters is if you're trying to get a certain amount of intensity time. And so most of those are set at 150 minutes per week. They want you to do like a 3 bouts of 50 minutes per week, or 5 bouts of 30 minutes, depending on your fitness level and whatnot. But that's the gold standard for brain health and heart health and longevity and all that. So the short answer to that is I wouldn't worry so much about whether or not your activity monitor zones are dialed in for performance. From a longevity perspective, the age equation is sufficient.
Perfect. Thank you.
You're welcome. If you're getting a little more intense or ninja with your heart rate training, like let's say you're trying to do high intensity cardio versus tempo cardio versus base cardio, and you'd like to get a good measure of heart stuff on there, I've done a workshop on cardiovascular exercise and talked about how you measure that and how you know what that's like, even without having an equation or fancy equipment and stuff. It's a pretty succinct thing. So let me know in the Better Daily group, and I'll drop the link to that. Good question. Any other questions this slide brought up? Good. Okay. Cool. Into the fold. Okay. So on this next slide, I've got a sample of what some of these printouts look like. This is from 2017. This is Garmin specifically. So I have a Garmin Vivo Active on. Fitbit looks a little bit different from this, and Garmin's even evolved their dash since 2017. But these are the screenshots I put together. So you can see there's on the left there's actually an activity count. This is number of steps you gotten per or versus your day goal right here at 6858 versus an 8,000 goal. And then you can set your sleep goals and your sleep and wake time. And then you can see active calories. That's how many calories are summarized to be burned in that 6,800 steps, and then how many calories you have remaining, meaning in your goal calories that it has calculated for how much you weigh versus how much you like to weigh. This is how much it's saying you should burn in that time. And then intensity minutes, this would be heart rate plus steps. This is when your little monitor, if you have that capability, you'll know if you have that capability because there's little blinking lights on the bottom here. That's a iridescent pulse ox. It's not really a pulse ox. It doesn't measure your blood oxygenation, but it can see whether or not the arteries in your arm are expanding or constricting, which is really cool, by the way. P.S. If you've been around the exercise world for a while, you used to have to wear those heart rate straps. Like, and for the ladies, you're like, whatever, it's like an underwire bra. But for us guys, we don't wear bras often, so if ever. Oh dear. Okay. Anyway, so then you've got a sleep breakdown. So some of these will even break down light sleep versus REM sleep versus deep sleep. Like I said, we'll get really deep into that in 2 weeks in our sleep workshop. And then there's the summaries. And in my opinion, these summaries are really powerful. And I've got a cartoonish picture of a cyborg guy with his hands on his hips. And you're like, why is that, Alex? And that's because that's the power of connecting technology to your habits is you can drill down on what you are up to. Because I mean, I can't even count my steps in one day, like ask me to walk around the block and count my steps. I'll probably get halfway around the block and then I'll be like, I've got this podcast to record, or Bennett will come flying in and run over my toe or something. And you're like, haha, dad, like, and there's the end of my step count. I don't know how many steps I've counted on this poor toe. So technology has a powerful way to give us a understanding of where we are. And that's one of the things I've noticed with my clients who have started counting their steps is when they start getting a metric around how active they are or how active they haven't been, suddenly it's like, oh, well, I want to get my 5,000 steps today. And so they actually do go get, a 20-minute walk in where they normally wouldn't have. And, to get the gold badge or the balloons or confetti or whatever it is that it throws at you. Mine buzzes and says, congratulations. And I always think it's a call. I'm like, oh, who's calling me? Oh, that's not. but that said, you can track your sleep, you can track your resting heart rate, you can track your activity. And I think from a futuristic perspective, this is one of the most powerful pieces of what technology can do for our health and fitness. This is a good place where it's synergistic. If we see what our habits are resulting in daily, then we can start to hone in on some of the things that are affecting us. For instance, there was a time period in my life about 2 years ago where I got less than 1,000 steps before lunchtime. And I didn't know that that's what I was doing. That's just how life kind of rolled out. I got cruddy sleep. We had a baby crying in the house in the middle of the night and stuff. And I'd get my coffee and I'd do my work and I'd take care of the baby and stuff. And it wasn't until lunchtime that, activity started to ramp up through the day. So one of the things that I could do for my own well-being and mindset and helping with stress and stuff was first thing in the morning when I got up, just go for a walk. Man, it helped my disposition so much, but I had no idea that was going on until I started looking at my steps and going, what in the world? How am I literally doing nothing until lunchtime? What's going on with me? So it's a powerful thing when you can take your consciousness and point it in a direction and say, I'm going to change that thing. I'm going to change that thing. And by changing that, I'll push myself in the positive direction of 1%. And so I intend to focus mostly on steps. This is just a quick summary of just the many studies that have been done on steps just since, I think this goes back to 2006. And it's powerful. You notice some of them have very small sample sizes, like there's sample size of 4 at the bottom there, and some of them have relatively larger ones, the 1788 in the middle, and they're powerful. Things like improving osteoarthritis in the knee with 10,000 steps a day. So you'd think like, hey, 10,000 steps, if I have knee problems, that's a lot of steps. Won't that hurt me? In a cohort of 1788, it was actually extremely helpful for the knee to do that over time. And if you're getting 2,000 steps today, don't do 10,000 tomorrow. Remember, that's exercise. That's a workout. We'll talk about intelligent progression in a second, but you'll notice this has been studied in so many different facets that it's almost undeniable that more steps for the average person is better. Now, there are some people on this workshop live right now that I know probably don't need more steps in their life. They're somewhere in the 15 to 18,000 range, maybe even 20,000 plus daily on the regular. And so I'm not talking to you. I'm not talking to you at the moment. You're getting great activity. Keep up the good work. Don't stop. Take good care of those knees and feet, because you're not going to keep going far if those feet fall apart on you. But for the rest of those listening, that you know that you're inactive, or maybe you've never tracked it before, but you're pretty sure you could be more active. These studies are powerful. Heart disease, diabetes, osteoarthritis, metabolism, weight loss, like it's almost undeniable the power of just getting more steps. And I mean, that could be going for a walk, that could be going for a jog, that could be hiking up some stairs, it could mean parking really far away from everything that you go to in a day. I used to joke that the way that I got my clients more steps is I asked them to drink lots of water all day, because then you'd have to get up and go pee more often, and that that got your steps. And that's not something you put off, by the way, for long. You got to pee, nobody can do it for you, right? So I'm going to hone in on some in just a second. Tim, I would say he's the step champion. He's too humble to say so, but this man gets a lot of steps in his day. He said, for me, this is a really easy metric to hone in on. It's like, how many steps did I get? And cool, great, keep up the good work, man. And that's something you can track over time. So that's great. There's fun chats going back and forth. I'm going to try not to get too distracted by. So this step number is very powerful. And if you're listening to this and you don't have a fancy activity monitor and stuff, and you're like, I don't want to spend $120 for my electronic nag to tell me to get more steps. They're cheap. Like, you can get like a cheap little pedometer from Walgreens. I think that was the first one I got, actually. It cost me $3. I got one from Walgreens because we were having a step challenge in the hospital that I was working in, and I was a transporter. So like, I annihilated everybody. It was so nice, because all I did all day was walk around the hospital, taking people from outpatient and bringing them to surgery, or taking them from surgery and putting them in inpatient, and all kinds of stuff. And so I get like 30,000 to 40,000 steps in a day, just because that was my job. I got paid to walk around for 8 hours a day. And so that was a lot of fun. But that was the first step counter I bought. It was like $3, a little blue thing. Like, if you drop that in a toilet, you're like, oh, oops, like, moving on. Nowadays, these are a little more intense. Don't well, it doesn't matter if you drop it in the toilet. I don't recommend it, but it's water resistant, so that's nice. So it's really all encompassing, and I intended to talk about just activity, but I did want to point this out. So this is a nifty infographic that just goes through all of the 20 benefits of walking 30 minutes a day. And that's really what a step counter is helping you see is where am I lacking in my activity in a day, and where can I possibly add in a walk, right? And I know that sounds so trite, but it's not trite at all. Things like reducing your risk of heart disease, maintaining your weight, preventing obesity. There was a really powerful study done in Taiwan where they looked at the genetic heritage of those who exhibited obesity. And what they found is there's 7 genes that generally lead to intense weight gain for people at different stages of life. And so what they tried to do is find out if there was types of exercises, different exercise modalities that buffered the obesity genetics that actually showed up, because you can have a gene for something, but it doesn't mean it has to show up, right? And so what they found was walking and jogging were the top 2 most powerful buffers to obesity genetics. Those people who reported walking and jogging regularly in their week were those who might have had the obesity genes, but were not obese themselves. And this was not true for things like weight training, cycling, swimming. And although those are great forms of exercise, from a genetic perspective, it doesn't seem that they have much of an impact on those who carry those obesity genes. And so, the benefits of walking 30 minutes a day, and I know some people who walk 30 minutes a day, a couple times a day, and cool, more power to you, keep up the good work. But this is powerful for some people. They're like, I know I need to start an exercise program, it just seems so big, I need to get equipment, I don't know what to do. It's like, no, if you're not doing anything, start walking, do that. Like, let's get consistent with that. Let's rack up some steps, because that all by itself can be powerful for anxiety. It can be powerful for depression. It can be powerful for your heart, for genetics, for coordination and balance and strengthening bones and muscles. It's just, there's not a lot of things in the fitness world that give you that much bang for your buck. Maybe vitamin D, but that's a topic for another day. So if you don't take anything else away from me today, please go get 30 minutes of a walk in every day, no matter what's going on, please. That would be very good in everybody's life. So, but I did promise that I would talk a little bit about the difference between men and women. And so this was a very interesting study. This is a relatively new one. I even put the citation here because it's 2019, October 5th. And basically everything from 2019 to now has been focused on coronavirus in one way or another. And so this was a very interesting study. I hadn't seen it until preparing for this workshop in particular. I thought I'd read most of the things on activity. But this study showed a significant improvement in sleep quality for women when it came to higher mean steps. So one of the questions is, how many steps should I get in a day? And we'll talk about incremental progress in a second, but 10,000 to 15,000 is the hyper beneficial area. And I've had clients who started at 2, and it took them 6 months to get to 7,000 on a regular basis, and they saw wonderful improvements. I'm not saying you have to get to 10 to 15 or it doesn't do anything good for you, but in this particular study, they looked at low mean steps, that meaning average, low mean steps, 5,000 or less per day with regard to sleep, and then they had a 5,000 to 10,000 steps per day, or excuse me, 5,000 to 12,000 steps per day. That was the average steps. And then high mean steps. These are the people who are 12,000 plus daily. And what you'll notice is men's sleep quality doesn't actually improve with more activity. And I know it looks like it slightly goes down. It's basically level 8.0 to 8.2. It's not like more activity makes men sleep more poorly. But women, on the other hand, the more active a woman reported, not reported being, they measured this over 4 weeks in these assessments. They reported subjectively, how well did you sleep? Did you feel well rested? Did you wake up multiple times in the night? Blah, blah, blah. Those sorts of questions. They self-reported sleep quality. Women reported improvements in their sleep quality directly related to how active they were. And so that's very fascinating to me, because I've worked with a lot of clients, both male and female, in the last 15 years. And I've noticed, anecdotally speaking, that women that I work with who do become more active, and I'm not saying like exercising intensely, I've had even very athletic women who, by nature of their work, weren't able to be as active during the day. I've had them report that increasing their step count actually did improve their sleep. They sleep harder, they sleep deeper, they sleep better. They're not waking up as early, especially, post menopause. That's really powerful. And that's not true of the men I've worked with. I've seen men run themselves into the ground 30,000, 40,000 steps in a day, and they don't report any difference in their sleep. What I've noticed with my men is that exercise is directly related to their sleep quality. You get a good weight training day in, you are done. You are out. You're going down for the count. But they have not studied the difference between those together yet. So I don't have a report to show you there, just anecdotal evidence. But I thought that was fascinating. So Kat says, that seems unfair. In order to sleep well, I should get more steps. That's not fair. There's a lot of things that aren't fair between being men and women. So if we want to open that can of worms, the whole pushing a watermelon out of your, well, we won't go there. But the point is, it's it's a very fascinating thing. So this study in particular has, in a few anecdotal stories with some of my clients, has changed the way that I coach some of my female clients with regard to their sleep. there's a lot of things we can talk about in 2 weeks about sleep, but one of the first things that I go to with my female clients is how many steps are you getting in a day? Because if there's a sweet spot where we can say, hey, if you can be this active, you will sleep better, and it works, man, well, you can't bottle that up and sell it because nobody makes money on it. But this study seems to be able to quantify with statistical significance that is true. So that said, I've said a lot of things so far, and we're going to get to some key points in a second with regard to modern metrics. But as I was walking through some of that research, have I generated any questions for anybody? I want to pause for questions, and then we'll get into these specific metrics and talk about why they might be important to different people.
What do you think about a run walk? Like run one day, walk the next, run the next day, walk the next day. Like I try to run like at least three times a week.
Yeah. And
I try to do it on like Monday, Wednesday, Friday after work, especially during the summer since my kids aren't in school anymore.
Yeah.
Or for the summer. But what if I ran on Monday and then walked on Tuesday, ran on Wednesday? Like, would that even, I don't know, at least I get more steps on the days I don't run.
That's a really good way to keep your activity up. Yeah. And I don't run every day, and I don't generally coach my clients to run every day. Even my clients who like to run every day, I'm like, stop it. Like, let's take a break.
Yeah, I could do it every day.
Yeah. Well, no, I mean, you can try, and you can do it for a little while, and then your joints will hate you. But yes, it's very common and powerful. Running's a good way to get a lot of steps, but walking is also a great way to get steps and is not as intense. And so if you're in a position where walking is not really exercise for you, then there's no reason you can't walk on your off run days to get your activity up. Great question. Any other questions out there? Good. Awesome. All right. So as far as step counters go today, we've evolved a lot past the pedometer thing. And the primary reason for that is actually being able to track heart rate at the same time. So heart rate plus activity yields all of these interesting metrics now. So the first one, and the thing I've been harping on this entire time, is steps. Daily, weekly, monthly steps. And that steps, that's average activity, is all around, I think, one of the most powerful markers for disease, longevity, and metabolic activity. And that's one of the reasons when I first started my company, Defining Dad Bod, that was like the first thing we focused on. It was sugar and steps, the two S's. If I could get you eating less sugar, and if I could get you increasing your steps, you would see positive results. And there are some people who would come to me from a coaching perspective, and they're like, hey, I've already dealt with the sugar part and I'm getting lots of steps. What's next? Like, great, you're above 95% of the population right now. Let's move on. Awesome. But that's a huge marker. If you don't take anything else away from me today, please work in a 30-minute walk every day. Work up to that. If you're not already doing that, start with a 10-minute walk, and increase that number. And remember that the sweet spot, the place with the most benefit, is that 10 to 15,000 step mark. And in the research, it's most often measured at 10,000 steps a day, because researchers said that was not an insurmountable amount of work for most people. It wasn't daunting. They could maintain that regularly. But the actual most powerful and positive benefits were somewhere in that 12 to 15,000 per day mark. Now that might be outlandish and scary to some, and so don't hear that you're not going to get benefits if you can't walk that much. I'm saying that no matter where you are, find where you're starting and add to that a good what am I trying to say? A good way to go about that is 500 extra steps every 2 weeks. That's a really good pace for progression. So if you're at 2,000, let's get 2,500 over the next 2 weeks. If you're at 5,000, let's get 5,500 over the next 2 weeks. And what you'll notice is you'll get to that 10,000 mark in a matter of a few months. And the reason that is important is walking. It can be a little stressful and strenuous on your muscles and your nerves, but they'll adapt quickly. What won't adapt quickly is cartilage, tendons, and ligaments. And so if you haven't been very active and you're trying to increase your step count, don't do it all at once. It will crush you, and you will not get your normal steps consistently, because it doesn't help you if you're getting 2,000 steps a day. It does not help you to get 10,000 tomorrow and then 0 for 5 days. It does not help you in the least to improve your average steps. Tendons and ligaments adapt extremely slowly. The cellular density in the tissues is very small. So that means that it takes much longer for those tissues to adapt. And if they don't get to adapt, then you get things like tendinitis or tendinosis, which is inflammations of the tendons, or it can set you up for small tears and strains, and you don't want that. It's the worst thing that can happen to you when you're trying to improve your activity, is to injure something that you kind of depend on in order to do that. So how to increase your steps? Start with wherever you're at, wear your activity monitor for about a week and just get an average, and then start adding 500 to that every 2 weeks, and you'll progress beautifully. That'll progress you over a period of 6 months. That could progress just about anybody to about 10,000 steps a day. And there's a few things worth saying about exercise to support your lower limbs there and stuff, but this isn't the place for it. So then you have your sleep score. We're going to talk a lot about this in 2 weeks. So really what they're doing is trying to add quality and quantity together. And on average, step counters used to just look at how much you moved in a night, which for somebody like me who likes to fight dragons in his sleep, I was not awake. I was actually asleep, and it should count as REM sleep, but those old activity monitors were like, you were awake. I'm like, no, I wasn't. I was punching my wife, who I don't actually punch in real life, but at night I'm like, hiya. So she puts a pillow between us, and well, that's just married life with Alex. So you can ask her, this is a true story. Anyway, that said, now we track heart rate. And so what that means is heart rate plus your actual movement can tell the activity monitor a little bit about REM and deep sleep. Now, this isn't 100% accurate, and there are some people who this doesn't really detect them well. So in sleep studies where they actually put the electrodes on people's head and they compared them to what the activity monitors were saying about their activity versus heart rate, they were accurate to about 78% of the time in REM sleep, and they were accurate to about 82% of the time in deep sleep. That said, that's an average. There are some people who fall well below that average. Maybe they have particularly active REM sleep, and so they get a little more REM sleep than the activity monitor says they're getting. And similar, they might have a higher heart rate during deep sleep. So what I would say, just like the steps thing, take the average, take your weekly average of your sleep score. And when you make changes to your exercise or nutrition program, or maybe even your sleep habits, just look and see how that average changes. So what I've noticed for some of my clients is they get better sleep scores. They're like, how do I get a 90 on my sleep score? I'm like, don't ask that. That's the wrong question, because Garmin will tell me I got an 82 tonight. Like, okay, you don't get an A+ for 100. It's just what's 82 compared to every other time Alex has ever slept with his Garmin activity monitor, right? And what I notice with many of my clients is things like hypertrophy training will increase the sleep score during the hypertrophy phase, but you can't do hypertrophy all the time. So you'll get better sleep during your hypertrophy phase, or at least I hope you'll commit to sleeping well while you're trying to grow those guns. But it won't, that's not something you can always do. And it's not like, I need to achieve 100, right? So it's a beneficial marker for average sleep, and to see how different things you're doing in your life is either improving or reducing that. This is especially helpful if you're starting a new medication or something, medication supplement, or maybe like a nighttime tea or something like that. What you'll notice is some of those things do have an effect on your sleep, most of the time in the negative. Most of the time you'll get poor sleep when you add something new, and that's worth knowing, because you don't know, you're not conscious of it. You don't know you slept poorly, but it would be helpful to have some metrics around that. So I would say steps matter more than the sleep score for most of the people that I've worked with, because sleep generally improves when you improve your activity. and that's exercise for guys generally, and steps for the ladies. But if you are having poor sleep, this will give you a number around that and actually help you to focus on what might be working well for you. And I'll dive into that more in about 2 weeks. Intensity minutes, this is associated with health outcomes. This is kind of a metric around volume of exercise. What I don't like about this measure is exercise is complicated. It just is. It's simple to measure this down, this activity thing, to how many steps you get in a day. That's actually really helpful. But as far as exercise is concerned, what you're doing and how you're doing it matters. And sometimes it matters way more than how many minutes you spent doing it, right? So that said, there are studies that look at intensity minutes regarding cardiovascular exercise, for instance, and they show improvements in anxiety and improvements in depression, improvements in cognitive decline and age-related degradation of body and mind. Those are all important, and they say 150 or more. Very simple. 150 minutes or more of intensity in a week is sufficient to stave off most of the issues that are related to not getting enough exercise. That said, there's like I said, exercise is pretty complicated. So as far as intensity minutes are concerned, this is not a very important measure to me from a training perspective. What I care a little more about for the people I'm working with is how many minutes did you spend actively exercising, in a week. I would rather know that you spent an hour doing cardio this week in 3 20-minute increments. And by cardio, that doesn't necessarily mean you went for a walk, maybe a jog, maybe you went on the Stairmaster, maybe you swam, but you got your heart rate up over that period of time. And then, you did 2 to 4 bouts of resistance training for 20 to 60 minutes at a time, right? That's a general baseline recommendation. It could be a little different for other people. And their Garmin might report 202 activity minutes, or it might report 120 intensity minutes because their weight training didn't get their heart rate nearly as high. Am I worried about that? No, because they're exercising their muscles intelligently and they're exercising their cardiovascular system intelligently. So the intensity minutes metric is not particularly important. I've found in my personal practice and the practice of my clients that this is my least interesting measure. It's the least helpful measure, not because it's not important, but because most of the people that I'm working with, we've already recommended intensity. So as long as I know we're getting those workouts in, then I don't want you to try to get more intensity minutes. I don't need you doing hill sprints because you need 10 more minutes on your activity monitor. It's likely just going to end up making your knees mad given what we've been up to this week, right? Stress and recovery. This is a very interesting measure that has a lot to do with how fit you are or aren't, even though you can't set that in the activity monitor. So activity monitors today are looking at heart rate variability. So, if you put your finger against your throat here, you can feel your pulse, boom, 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 boom. There's actually variability between each pulse. So, some of it is quick, some of it is strong, and there's variability between each pulse. And the more variable it is, the more differences there are between every 10 beats or so, then the higher your stress load is likely. That's called heart rate variability. So there's actually 2 warring nervous systems in your body. There's the parasympathetic and the sympathetic nervous system. Parasympathetic is like, I'm relaxing, I'm vegging out, I've just finished a workout and I'm tired, right? Or I just woke up from a nap or something like that. That's parasympathetic. And it's responsible for things like your digestive tract. It's kind of your unconscious. You don't tell your food to digest, it just does it, right? You don't tell your heart to beat, it just does it. So the parasympathetic nervous system's over here doing its thing. The sympathetic nervous system is like your conscious one. When you say, oh, I'm thirsty, I'm going to grab a drink of water. That's your sympathetic nervous system. Your parasympathetic nervous system's telling your heart to beat. If you've got a lot going on, you're stressed out, you're trying to do things, then those 2 systems create noise in the nervous system, and that changes how variable the heart rate is. So if your activity monitor is telling you you're stressed and you're not really stressed, what it means is you have not been exercising, usually, you've not been exercising adequately enough to put those two nervous system issues in sync. So your activity monitor is reading the variability in your heart rate as you you haven't shown it what stress looks like. There you go. That's the best way to put it. You haven't shown your activity monitor, no, this is actual stress. So then when it reads your heart rate variability, it's set to the wrong baseline. So anyway, that said, the stress battery measure is very interesting. I wouldn't say that it's like the holy grail of measures. This is especially important to me when I'm working with people who I know are exercising intensely on a regular basis. So when they're doing 5 days a week, 6 days a week of hardcore training, this stress and recovery thing is pretty important because that tells me how worn out we are from a bodily perspective. And, you know, if you're dealing with pain, poor sleep, that can also mess this measure up quite a bit. And I'm not saying it doesn't matter. I'm just saying it's probably not the best measure of whether or not you're actually stressed, because, you know, it might say you're stressed and you're like, no, I'm not. So it's reading your heart rate variability. It's probably set to a poor foundation. And again, if you're in pain, that's the parasympathetic and sympathetic nervous system clashing there. But one measure that is super important, and this is probably the second most important measure to steps, in my opinion, that an activity monitor can tell you if it's equipped with heart rate, is your resting heart rate. Your resting heart rate is an extremely powerful measure of how healthy your cardiovascular system is, really. And the harder your heart has to beat and the faster your heart has to beat at rest, the worse off it's going to be over the long haul. And this is something that's consistently improved through nutrition and exercise. And so I love seeing with my clients, I love seeing that when we first start working together, their resting heart rate starts pretty high. They're in the 80s, maybe 90s, maybe even higher. And then, you know, by the time we're 6 months in, they're hanging out around the 50s and 60s. And to me, you get about 1 billion beats as a mammal, you get about 1 billion cardiovascular beats in your life. And if your heart rate is really, really high, then we're just taxing the heck out of those cardiac muscles, and it will kill you faster. So we want to drop your resting heart rate. And I mean, 1 billion beats is a lot of beats. There's plus or minus there, obviously. And I'm not saying when you hit 1 billion, you drop dead. I'm just saying that mammals in general, that's one of the most limiting factors to life. That's the number one killer, is cardiovascular failure. So then just a second, we've got a couple of chat things here I want to make sure. Somebody said, can we talk a bit more about the marginal utility of going from 15 to 20K? Given my size, it feels productive, but I might be wrong. A really good question, Tim. So he's asking, you know, I said that the major research benefits of 12 to 15,000 is where things really pay off, but they kind of level off at that. And he's asking, is there any utility in that 15 to 20,000 area? And the answer is the marginal utility is less than the 12 to 15,000 mark, but it's not zero. There is utility in going from 15,000 steps a day to around 20,000 steps per day. The concerns are injuries. That's a lot of stress and strain. And so for short periods of time, it makes a lot of sense to do that. There's some people who are built such that it doesn't really affect them in a negative way, and keep on keeping on, man. I'm not going to tell you to stop moving. But I will say that the research seems to cut the benefits off at 20,000 as far as activity is concerned. Now, exercise adaptations for endurance that lasts more than 20,000 steps, those are pretty well fleshed out. And there are benefits to doing more than 20,000 steps in an endurance event every once in a while. But making a consistent 30,000 step a day, you know, goal or something along those lines, it's just not, the proof isn't in the pudding with regard to body composition or metabolic progress. I will say that the centenarians, the blue zones in the world, where people are living to, you know, 100, 115, you know, that sort of thing, they are averaging 28,000 or more steps in a day in their 90s. Now it's not clear whether or not that's causal. It's not clear whether or not getting 28,000 steps a day is going to help you live to 100 or not. But that is a very interesting thing to note. And that's not something we can really, it's a very hard thing to research. It's like, okay, we're going to look at these people and tell them, you're going to walk 28,000 steps a day for the next 30 years and see whether or not that keeps you to living to 100. Like, who's going to volunteer for that study? You better pay me a lot of money. And I like activity. So that said, Tim, I would say as long as it's not injuring you to get 20,000 steps a day regularly, then awesome. But if you are experiencing injury, you're experiencing knee, ankle, foot, hip, back stuff, then it's possible that you're going to need a break from that. Because from a weight loss perspective, and I know that's a important goal for you right now, from a weight loss perspective, getting 5,000 less steps in a day isn't going to make game-changing difference if you can't do it all the time, right? So right now, it might be something along the lines of, as you're in the thick of your weight loss journey, 20,000 steps a day makes a lot of sense, and you go for that, and then after achieving the weight loss goals that you'd like to achieve, then maintaining a 15,000 steps per day practice to keep that body composition where you like it or where it needs to be for you, then that would be beneficial. So I hope that answers your question. I don't think you're doing any harm as long as you're not getting injured to do that 15 to 20,000 steps. But from a research perspective, they just haven't been able to show that has significantly long-term benefits to health and whatnot to get more than 20,000 steps outside of the case studies of the blue zones. So very good question. Another question here was, would a murmur affect HRV? Absolutely, yes. If you have an arrhythmia or a heart murmur, that would affect your HRV, because your heart rate variability, because what happens in a murmur basically is that you have an irregular heartbeat in there. And so sometimes it'll detect, I've seen this in some folks that I've done cardiometabolic examinations on folks, and so they would get on something and it would show they have a heart rate of 120 and they're just standing there. It's like, 120? Like, you should be at least breathing hard, and so I would take a manual pulse. And what I would find is that my manual pulse would read them at an 85 beats per minute, but my electronic heart rate monitor would tell me that they were at 120. And so what was happening is the electronic sensor was was sensitive enough to read the murmur as an extra heartbeat. And so they were getting marginally more readings on their actual heart rate than what was a full contracted beat. And so yes, activity monitors who are using that infrared on your wrist to detect how your arteries are expanding, because that's what happens. Your heart beats and your artery goes kind of like that, and much faster and much smaller, right? But that's what's happening. And so if you have a murmur that your heart beats and it kind of does an extra beat in there, or an extra half beat or quarter beat, depending on how intense your murmur is, that can certainly throw off your heart rate variability, because it'll read as a difference between each heartbeat, but it's not really. It's actually mechanical. It's at the level of the heart. So very good question. Tim says, hey, thanks for that. Give me 10 more days to finish my challenge and I'll drop the step count a bit. Awesome. Great questions. Thank you guys for dropping those in the chat. Last but not least, and I really like this measure, this is Insights, and it might be because I'm a data geek, but I love looking at, Garmin, Fitbit, a few of the other companies who are in the activity monitors game. They have collected the largest storage of human activity data ever. Like, once upon a time, if you wanted 1,000 people in a study to wear a pedometer for 4 weeks and see how many steps they got, you had to pay them money to do that. Like, here's a pedometer. We'll give you the pedometer. Here's $100 to be in our study. Record these, and they had to write it down, because the pedometers, the $3 pedometer from Walgreens, little lead thing jumping up and down, it didn't sync to your Bluetooth smartphone. Smartphones didn't even exist, so it was really expensive to do these studies. And now we've got activity monitors all over the place, and people have them Bluetooth connected to their phone. And most of the time, people are like, "Sure, Garmin, I don't mind you seeing my step data." And so we have a huge cache of this stuff, and it's fascinating to me to see. For instance, I run. I think I'm a runner. I run sometimes. I run about 2 to 3 days a week, depending on how cold it is outside, because I'm a big baby about the cold. I think I run a lot, but apparently I run more than about 70% of Americans. But there's 30% of Americans who run way more than me, um, in terms of miles and intensity. And fine, I'm not trying to beat those people, but I think that's very interesting. It's also very interesting to me when people come to me and say, "Hey, Alex, how much should I be running to be in the kind of shape you're in?" I'm like, apparently I run less than 30% of Americans. So there's that. And the same thing goes with regard to steps and sleep and that sort of thing. So I don't think this is the most important measure, but I do think it's very interesting. And I also think it's interesting in placing yourself uh, in in a realistic setting for you. So I have a client I'm working with, and she'll say, "Was it good? I wasn't able to get enough steps this week. I'm sorry I couldn't hit my step goal. I have this going on. I have this going on." But I know those are just excuses. And it's like, look, you are doing better than 82% of women who are your age in America. Like, and I'm not saying, you have to compare yourself to everybody all the time, but I'm saying, like, for this particular person, it's a really powerful thing to know. It's like, what are other 68-year-old women doing with their time in activity right now? And no indictment on them, but hey, like, don't get down about missing your step count a few days this week. Like, good job. That's amazing. Keep up the good work. And that's really at the heart of the whole betterment thing is um don't compare yourself to an ideal of what you think you should be. Instead, do two other things. Draw some encouragement from the people around you. I think Insights is a good way to do that. I think Better Daily as a community is a good way to do that. But also compare yourself to who you were yesterday. So my answer to this client, because she had, back surgery and she had to do this stuff, it's like, "How active were you last year?" She's like, "Oh, I don't even know. I didn't even have an activity monitor last year. I sat on my butt a lot." And like, "Well, how active were you when you first started wearing this thing?" She's like, "Oh my gosh, like, I was lucky if I got 1,200 steps a day." Fantastic. Right now you're whining about not getting 7,000 steps in a day, like, but you got 5. So proud of you. Keep up the good work. So that said, these metrics are interesting and powerful. The two that I would pay the most attention to are steps and resting heart rate. There's a reason to worry about sleep or intensity minutes and maybe your heart rate variability, but those are the two things that I find most valuable from an activity perspective. So I want to go over key points, but I've been talking a lot, so I'd like to see if there are any burning questions out there before I keep going through and summarizing these. Scott, Mark, Kat, Katie, anything on your mind you want to talk about?
I have one if it's all right.
Yeah, bring it.
Are you going to get to the VO2 max?
I didn't intend to. So what's your question? Let's do that.
Well, first, what the heck is it? And it's measuring when I sleep, right? Is that the only time?
It measures a few different things. That's your SpO2 when you sleep. Yes.
Well, that's a separate one, isn't it?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, but when they do the VO2 max, they include that as part of your sleep score?
Good question. So two things. VO2 max technically is how much oxygen we can pull into our body, get all the way to our cells, use for metabolism, and then turns into carbon dioxide on the way out. So VO2 max is the maximum amount of oxygen we can do that with. And VO2 is just a measure of that anytime. So how much oxygen are you currently pulling into your body, utilizing at the level of your cell, and then pushing out in the form of carbon dioxide. Now, the sleep tracker on the Garmin's, it will give an SpO2 reading. That's a measure of blood oxygenation, and it can only do it when you're sleeping because you have to be very still. And even then, it's not always very accurate. But what that's looking at is how much oxygen's in the bloodstream. So if you've ever gotten sick and you've had to go to the hospital or something and they put a little thing on your finger and they're looking at how much oxygen's in your bloodstream, they want to keep it above a certain number, usually 90 or more. If you get it below 90, that's not good. So what your activity monitor will do is it will measure your estimated VO2 based on your activity in a week. That's how much oxygen you're moving. So your estimated VO2 max is related to how many calories you burn in a day, for instance. It's a good measure of metabolism. But the SpO2 reading on sleep is looking at how oxygenated your blood is in your sleep. And that's related to things like sleep apnea. So if somebody's not breathing much when they're sleeping at night or they're snoring a lot, then their SpO2 markers are lower. And that's usually an indication that they should get a sleep study done because their adenoids, for instance, might be clogging their ability to breathe, or maybe they like a little mouth guard. They have these mouth guards now. I know it'd be weird to sleep with one, but they have mouth guards now that will actually open up your airways a little bit and increase that SpO2 marker. Because some people are getting crappy sleep and they don't know it until they find out in the middle of the night they've got a 70 for their SpO2 and it should be like 90. So good question. Does that help? Because those are two different measures that it'll give you.
Yeah, I had the sleep study done. I was supposed to be on a respirator, but I thought I was doing good till I saw those scores.
So your activity monitor was like, no, actually, you're not breathing in the middle of the night.
Yeah, I'll get my respirator thingy back out, or it's that oxygen, that loud machine.
A little Darth Vader in your life.
No, it goes in the nose, but
that sounds like fun.
At least it ain't as bad as 70, but it ain't good. I'll send you the numbers. You can check them out.
Yeah, please share it with the group if you don't mind sharing. I think we would all find that interesting. Also, I haven't looked at my SpO2 number since I got this thing, so maybe I'll play that game with you.
Yeah. Thanks.
You got it. Any other questions out there? Cool. All right, I'm going to wrap up our key points here, and then we'll close out on a high note. And let you guys enjoy your Tuesday night. So key points here. Tonight we talked about a difference between exercise and activity. And so the question is, can an activity monitor be helpful for you? Yes, but it's not an indication of activity, not an indication of exercise, which is movement that adapts you, versus activity, which is just how much you actually move. And so that said, it's helpful to have a step count practice. I think that's a foundation for conditioning. It's a foundation for health, but it's not a stand-in for exercise. It's the start. It's the foundation for. And if somebody were to ask, should I start exercising? And I'm like, well, how sedentary are you? And they're like, I never walk. Then I'm like, don't start exercising yet. Don't do that. Like maybe if it makes you feel good, do some movements and stuff. But you need to get moving. Like you need to. I don't care what you do. Just go do it. That would be good, and do it consistently and well. Another key point tonight was that tech solutions can be helpful as an indication of where you can improve. So we talked about steps, we talked about sleep score, we talked about resting heart rate. And I think it's so powerful and important that when we put ourselves in the driver's seat for our own health and fitness, if we have these metrics, then it equips us to make calls about things in our life, whether or not a certain supplement's working for us, or whether or not a certain medication's wigging us out. And it gives us some ammo to advocate on our own behalf. I have a client who goes to the doctor, and he's talking about her weight, and she's making improvements and stuff, and she's like, look at my step count, look what I've done, and that was actually the impetus she needed for him to take her off of cholesterol and blood pressure medications, because he was seeing improvements in all of her markers and metrics. But then he saw that she had gone from 2,000 and 3,000 steps a day to 8,000 steps a day, and that her intensity and her VO2 and her sleep, everything was improved. And he's like, he had nothing to stand. I was like, yeah, you don't need to be taking these anymore. Like, we'll taper them down and get you off of them. And so that's a big deal. Tech solutions in this day and age, if you can make sense of these markers and make them work for you and help you be focused about what changes are worth making so that you can be consistent, that's huge. Your step goal should reflect your improvement in attainability. Tonight, I talked about some of the research around getting 10,000 steps a day or 12,000 steps a day. And Tim asked about getting even 20,000 steps a day. How many steps you should get in a day is a great goal that requires an average. You need to know where you're starting so that you can incrementally improve yourself over time, if that is beneficial and good and important to you. So don't read a study and go, oh, I need to go get 10,000 steps. Don't do that. Find out where you are, and then start from that place and incrementally improve yourself. Like I said, I think 500, increasing your step goal 500 a day for 500 every 2 weeks. There we go. That's what I'm trying to say. Not 500 a day for every 2 weeks. That would be bad. But anyway, start where you're starting and improve yourself over time there. Slow and steady wins the race. Be the tortoise, not the hare, when it comes to step goals. Sleep trends and health. The sleep score marker isn't an A+ thing. I hate that in Garmin they make them orange if you get an 80 or something, or red if you get a 60. Like, that's not helpful. I wish they wouldn't do that. The point is, where are you regularly, and how does what you're doing every day affect that, right? So maybe you find that 2 glasses of wine messes up your sleep, but 1 glass of wine doesn't. Or maybe you find that fasting messes up your sleep. And so you need to find a way to get your fasting practice on board with your rest. Or maybe you find that you sleep better on weight training days, or maybe you need to get to bed a little earlier on those days. So those trends are helpful, but don't put a lot of stock in the actual absolute number. Intensity minutes are very subjective. If you're deconditioned, conditioned, or trained, it's not a really helpful marker, in my opinion, about how much exercise you should get or how much exercise you are getting. Stress and recovery trends are important. We talked about some of the caveats and heart rate variability and whatnot. The most interesting and helpful measure in there would be your resting heart rate, your baseline resting heart rate. And then insights. As a rule, I like to teach people not to compare themselves to other people, but to compare themselves to who they were yesterday. But these insights can be really helpful and important when it comes to building a case in your own mind for the progress that you're making, and then how important it is to pull your community alongside you to do that with you. There are people in your workplace who need you to say, come walk with me. There are people in your church who need you to say, let's go for a walk. Everybody wants to sit down and talk over lunch. Like, let's have a walking conference, let's have a walking meeting, and that's important to wrap your head around, because at the end of the day, there are many things that are difficult about health and fitness. There are many things that are complicated, but this is not complicated. This is not complicated. This is something that many people could benefit from. And there are very few things in life that are this easy. And I'm not saying it's easy to change habits. I'm just saying there are not many things that just require a good pair of shoes. There just isn't. I wish there were more things like that, but there just isn't. So if this is something we can get down for ourselves and maybe rub off on other people, that would be a good way to make the world better. So I've said a lot of things tonight. Let me hear from you. Any other burning questions before we call it a night? And Mark, you are new to Better Daily, and you just hung with us for a whole hour and 10. Did I scare you away, or was this helpful to you?
No, I am so impressed at having both myself paid attention, but you kept my attention. Now
Good.
The info was great. You're well prepared. You're so organized. It's great.
Oh, thanks. Yeah. Appreciate that. Thanks, Mark. Glad to have you here, brother. Any questions from anybody before we call it a night and we can call this a good workshop? Everybody just wants to go get a walk in now, right? At 8 p.m. Don't do that. Start tomorrow morning. That would be good. All right, guys. Thank you so much for joining us. This has been Alex VanHouten with Better Daily. I hope that this was great for you as well. Get those steps in and be smart about it. Until next time, kick butt and take names.